A good ride, avoiding reality part-time since 2006 and full-time since 2010. The Mind Expander. Spring break tree hunter. So here we are looking at two of my all-time favorite powder boards. The Capita Spring Break is something you've seen on our site year over year. This tree hunter I've had for I think 3 years now. Here's my daughter's balloon saying hello. And I went up, took a run each, hiked up my local mountain, and before the resort opened on a crowded Christmas Eve day, and hiked up first thing in the morning with this one, then went right back to my car, got another board, hiked back up, and took this down, because the other, like a few days before that, there's another powder day. It was thicker, it was wetter, it was like, this was like 1.5 feet of kind of semi-light. The other day when I took this out against 7 other boards in my quiver, or boards that I had, all a bunch of different boards that just floated really well, like you know, anything from free ride boards to powder boards, like the Yes Optimistic 151, like you know, the Rome POW Division 153, and a bunch of other boards. And I took those all out. I'm about to do that review next. But it was just cold and wet every time I wanted to film, and crowded, so I just thought it would be better to sit here with you, good glass of scotch, and just tell you my take. But let's just cut to the chase before I get into the details. On this particular day, in these particular conditions, against the 7 other, you know, boards that float well, you know, free ride boards to maybe almost powder boards, snow surf boards, this was just the king by a lot. And it's just been blowing my mind how much more I like it than my 154. It's just so fast and speedy. So I had to put it up against my all-time floater in my quiver, the 161 Tree Hunter. I know there's some bigger boards, but and some other boards that are very similar, even in the spring break line, that might float a little better. But this is, you know, I don't like going like for that super big board. But this is one of the floatiest boards I've ever ridden for its size and specs. And when you compare the two, this is narrower, it's thinner, it's got some taper, it's got a really, you know, it's got like 20 mil of taper. It's got kind of more of a normal waist, you know, for a board like of this shape. This is much wider, like from like here up. This is a much wider nose, much wider waist, kind of like, but when you get down to the tail, as you can see here, they're both kind of similar. And then what's interesting though, is if you look at this rocker, like I'm just gonna push this whiskey forward or scotch forward and kind of show you that if you compare the two, you just stand them up straight, you can see how this one just rocks out. You know, the Jones Mind Expander rocks out so much further. They're both flat to rocker, but the Spring Break is more of a typical flat to rocker. It's just got a subtle rise. And then look at this one. This just goes up so much more, and I think that's one of the reasons why it's such an amazing powder board. You know, they market it as, you know, more than a powder board. They market it as kind of like an all mountain, kind of like a free ride board, but I haven't felt that. I feel like, yeah, it dominates on the mountain. It's pretty good for what it is, for flat to rocker, but I think it's a powder board up here, like at the top. It's like its primary purpose is powder board, giving you kind of like combining the Storm Chaser and like the flagship in a surf rockery kind of shape. So it's kind of up there. But then groomers, it's not bad, where a lot of other boards are still, you know, they're great in powder, great in groomers. They're kind of like right here. This is kind of like amazing in powder and really good in groomers, where this is just amazing in powder, just as amazing in its own different way, and just a little less in groomers. It's not as much fun to take out when it's, you know, when it's medium snow, firm snow. This has good edge hold, and it's really fun to turn until you get into carves. Then it starts to get a little boring compared to a lot of boards with other camber. But this is mainly about powder. And the other day when I took this out, I actually felt like this floated and turned and just was a little more fun in powder than this one. Maybe it's just because this is the new shape, or maybe it's just because of that surf rocker, but this just felt like it had a little easier float in about the 1.5 foot of powder I was in, where this had almost the same float, but with this, the setback on board is a little further back. I think you're like, you know, I think you're like 5.25 inches back on board if you set it all the way back, which I did. I rode both these boards with Union Falcors, and I, you know, same exact run. You know, the first run was here, the second one was here. They were literally right next to each other. Same depth of snow, same run, and same, you know, I set these bindings back. I went 22 wide, and I set them both as far back as they could go. And I was wearing my Adidas Tactical ADVs. And this just felt to have a little more directional float, which really surprised me because this is so thick and wide. But the deeper it gets, this board just never sinks. It just sits on top of the snow. I've ridden this in like 3 feet of powder, 2.5, 3 feet of powder. And this thing was just floating like a champ. It outfloated all the other boards we tested it against that day. And you can see that comparison kind of sitting around here, probably somewhere in this review. But this feels like it can hang in the deepest of deep, because I took out the 54 in 2.5 feet of pretty light powder, though, pretty amazing powder for the Pacific Northwest. And this 54 floated really well. So imagine what the 58 could do. They felt like piers. This just felt a little quicker turning, a little more surfy, which was surprising, because this has like 40 millimeters plus of taper, and this is like 20, but this felt more surfy. Maybe there's, you know, something else going on. This felt more set back on board, like you were more on the tail of a surfboard. This felt a little more cruisery, like more of a cruiser, more kind of like more fun boardy, where it just has that easy cruising kind of thing, where this felt like you could kind of hammer through trees. This feels like this likes air a little more than this one. This one isn't ideal for air. You kind of want to keep it to the snow and just kind of turn and float and just get through it all. This I felt a little more comfortable when I got into the trees. This turned a little faster. This base just had way more glide. They both were waxed and scraped the night before, so same wax, same everything. This was no slouch at all. This is super easy floating cruising base, but this just has unreal glide for whatever they're doing there. I know there aren't many different bases out there that you can get, but for some reason in this price range, this was gliding better than almost any board I've ever ridden in this price range. It just really has an easy glide to it. It kind of reminded me of like, you know, like some of the bases I've tried on Gentum stick. They just have glide. It's getting closer to those. You know, those are still at another level, but it just really carried its speed. And all in all, I mean, both are amazing boards. This is just really floaty and cruisy, a little more centered. This is a little more off the tail, a little more surfy, you know, a little more slashy. But it felt like, yes, the Mind Expander felt like the tail sunk a little bit more, but it felt like that nose is just unburiable. You know, it's almost impossible to cartwheel on this board. Even on the 54, I leaned forward just to see if I would cartwheel, and I couldn't get it to cartwheel, which was stupid of me, but I did it anyways. And this is just the floater too. They're both amazing boards. And this is all based on my specs. Look at my specs, see how and you see how I ride. And, so this was just right there with this, maybe even a touch better that day. But they're both amazing boards. They're both highly recommendable boards. And they're two of my all-time favorites for riding powder. I think it really just comes down to your personal preference and your riding style, but both of these boards are amazing.